And what's amazing about Ringo that maybe some of the listeners don't know, some of the new listeners, is that Ringo is not right-handed.
That's right. He's a southpaw.
Darin, maybe you can contribute to this. How does a drummer react to that?
I'm a right-handed player, but I have flipped my drum kit around a few times to try to do the same thing I do right-handed, left-handed. And I've had various degrees of success. I'd never do it in public.
Now, that Ringo drum setup was, though, for a righty.
He leads with his left hand primarily, and which is why on some of those Beatle tracks, you'll hear the drums going up in pitch instead of down, because that's just how his body does it. A right-handed drummer does this. Even Paul McCartney, also a left-handed guy and a right-handed drummer.
Can't get out of my bed. There's a thought crime running through my head. Can't take these rules, and people are fools who believe what they read and believe what they see, believe what they see on the TV. Like iPhones.
Hello, welcome to episode 20 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. So here we are again. It's Saturday, 21st of September, and this is part 2 of my talk with David Bedford. I would, of course, urge you to listen to part 1, although I suppose they could exist as separate entities. This was a talk I did back in July, the end of July, when I was in Liverpool there having a visit. David's a great guy, as I said before. We had a lovely chat, great rapport. And in this part of the talk, he continues talking about Ringo's drumming and Pete Best's drumming. And he comes up with an interesting idea. In fact, it doesn't have to be Pete or Ringo. It can be both. And that's linked to David talking about the band's transition from a rock group to a pop group. He talks about his books as well. He's got 3 books. Well, 3 reference books, let's say. Beatles books per se, but he also talks about a detective novel that he wrote. He branched out to that, but there's a Beatles connection there. I think he calls it Faction, fact and fiction together. He also talks about some of the unsung heroes in Liverpool who helped the Beatles in their various stages of their development. Now, what you just heard there was a gentleman called Darin Murphy, D-A-R-I-N, Murphy, and that was a clip from a podcast I listened to, must be a year or maybe even 2 ago, of the When They Was Fab podcast, which is another Beatles podcast, very recommended. And Darin did this incredible show where he was demonstrating Ringo's, also Pete Best a little bit, but mainly Ringo's drum technique. And he takes you album by album and talks about the sound that Ringo got for each album and his continuing development. It really is one of the best podcasts, whether or not you're a drummer or a Beatles fan. Obviously if you're a musician of some kind, it's going to be of great value. But I'll put a link to that, absolutely. And you will be hearing a couple more clips of Darin intercut with the David Bedford interview today. David also talks about the somewhat intricate details of Brian and the Beatles' legal agreement and the quote-unquote sacking of Pete Best. So quote-unquote because, as David will reveal, having talked to David Harris, who was the lawyer involved in it, the sacking was not thus. Anyway, you'll have to listen further to hear that. So let's go straight in, and I'll be back on the other side to tell you about which guests are coming up. So I'll see you for a few words at the end. Okay, enjoy.
There's a book of just transcripts of all the interviews, the press conferences they did. Yeah. And I love reading that. And you got banal question is asked. Same old thing, when's the bubble burst? Ask me something interesting. Yeah. And then they ask a question, John says something, Paul says something, he goes backwards and forward, then says, Ringo jumps in and says such and such, everybody laughs. Then they go back to the questions. And I think the best thing that ever happened to Ringo was the American tour in '64. Because
suddenly at the forefront, wasn't it? Yeah.
Over here, as he admitted, it took him about 12 months to break in with John, Paul and George. And of course, whenever they're asking the questions, I haven't been with them 12 months yet, so it was difficult to say. In America, that didn't matter, because Brian had established these are the 4 Beatles. And
so they're all starting at the same place, basically.
Yeah. So he could just be himself, and he's naturally funny. It's like a lot of Scousers get together. Everyone's a comedian. You've got to laugh to live here. And that is just natural. So when we see the four of them in a press conference, as a Liverpoolian, that's quite natural. They wouldn't have stood out, particularly in Liverpool. Everybody does that. But outside of Liverpool, it's completely different thing.
Yeah.
Well,
And the accent and everything.
yep. Now the accents were exaggerated a bit.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, would you agree they played that up?
Yeah.
And I'm pleased that you mentioned the Spice Girls, didn't you, in one of your
Oh,
interviews?
yeah.
Yeah, because I've always thought that, and I've always been afraid
They were the Spice
to parallel that. They were the Spice Boys.
Brian created the first boy band.
Yeah, the Spice Boys.
The Spice Boys.
Yeah.
They were.
John was scary. Well, none of them were sporty, though, were they? There's the only problem.
No, they were definitely not
No, they
sporty.
weren't.
Yeah, Paul was cutie Spice.
None of them were ginger,
Yeah, George
Scary,
was
cutie.
quiet Spice.
Quiet Spice, and
John was cynical, sarcastic Spice.
yeah, Ringo is doleful Spice.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Going back to his style, yeah.
Yeah.
A good word, I think. Well, at the beginning, obviously, he could play all the fast stuff, and people talk about Washington Coliseum,
Yeah.
and I watched that back. It's like
He's everywhere.
flying for it, and his kit's almost falling off
yeah.
as well. Yeah. But a good word, I think, for the latest stuff is like loping, because something like she said. He's doing what they call backwards fills.
Yeah.
And if you listen to it, they're always coming in slightly late.
Yes.
But it kind of works with that sort of stoned backwards vibe. It's this sort of loping style. It's just perfect.
There is a thing in rhythm known as a pocket, okay? And if you've got a metronome, and the metronome is going to be playing right on the beat, right? So everything is measured in quarter notes and eighth notes, or surrounding each one of those notes is a very thin sort of cushion of time, which is known as the pocket. And drummers make choices as to where in that cushion of time they're going to put each part of the drum kit. The snare drum can land several places. It can land right on top of the beat. It can land slightly ahead of the beat. It can land slightly behind it. And where that lands determines the way the song is going to feel. Same thing with the kick drum. Led Zeppelin, for example, John Bonham is a very deep pocket kick drum player. He hits slightly behind the beat, which gives it a lot more ferocity, a lot more depth. Someone like Earth, Wind, and Fire that's a little more jazz-oriented, he's going to play right on top of the beat, right? So Ringo falls a little bit more into the category of John Bonham. His kick drum is very just slightly behind the accurate beat, but his snare is right on top of it, which is what keeps everything so tied together. That was what made that band so tight. He and Paul had this unspoken understanding of what their rhythm needed to feel like and sound like, and that's why they gelled so quickly as a rhythm section. And it turned John and George into new musicians. It changed the way they played.
There's a very good documentary made about George Martin a few years ago, and there's a lovely bit of, they're in the studio, George and Ringo, and George Martin was saying you could always tell that's a Ringo track. And Ringo was explaining, said, as a drummer, you've got this short space of time to make your beat, and I always liked to try and come in at the end of the beat, not at the beginning. It's a split-second thing. I don't think everybody can do that, but he had this natural ability that he could not hit right at the beginning of the beat, just as it's coming out, and that's a perfect example there. He could adjust what he was doing to whatever the song was. I say to everybody, go and listen to every Beatles song and listen for the drumming. I play air drums, it's as good as I get, and you put Strawberry Fields Forever on. Ringo was drumming in that.
I mean, that's tribal. It's
just brilliant.
Yeah,
it's hypnotic.
It's primal.
Yeah.
I think that's what gets people, isn't it?
Yeah. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
He knew the right rhythm for the right song, instinctively.
I think also he was maybe had that old-fashioned work ethic as well.
Yeah.
From stuff I've read, it was like he'd be ultra reliable in the studio, and he'd do 8 hours in the studio, and he'd go home to his wife, Maureen would stay up, say, "How was your day, dear?" Just so happened his day was like 10 in the evening till 6 in the morning. It wasn't quite.
It was weird hours.
It was 9 to 5, but the wrong way around. So I think that's
one of the skills that they loved about Pete. He said, because you'd say, "This is what we're doing," said, and he would just keep that beat going and going and going for as long as you wanted. Said, and his repertoire, because he hadn't come through the skiffle era, he'd gone straight into more of the rock and roll R&B stuff, developed his own sound.
The way Pete tells it, most of the people around Liverpool were copying the Shadows. They were Cliff Richard's backup band that became an instrumental phenomenon Hank Marvin was the guitar player. He was a guitar god in the music community in England. So they were a highly revered band, even by the Beatles. But the Beatles weren't interested in copying their sound. They liked more of a pounding rock and roll sound, which came from Pete Best just leaning into his kick drum and stomping, a faster version of what became known later on as disco. But Pete Best would sort of put that twist beat to it. Or he did the ride cymbal for the most part. So it was just going to be this. That was the only fill that you'll ever hear Pete Best do. He does it on every single record, just 16th notes on the snare.
And the way I describe it in the fourth Beatle book is when Pete left, that was the end of the Beatles, and a brand new group called the Fab Four was born, which was a pop group. And this is where, and I think some Beatles fans struggle to say, well, can we really like both Pete and Ringo? So I'm saying, yes, you can. Because for those 2 years, Pete was with them. At the time when John said they were at their best, the rock and roll years, they were a fantastic band, mainly covers.
We all missed out on that, didn't we?
We did, we missed out. If Pete couldn't play drums, there's no way he would have lasted 2 years or 2 weeks. So with Pete as the drummer, they developed their sound. They became the best rock and roll band, Liverpool, Hamburg. Yeah. They got Brian as a manager, they got a record contract. But they were becoming a new group, which was a pop group who were going to be writing mainly their own material. That's a different band, different skill set. Now, who knows? Pete could have done that, we don't know. That was the end of his career, but when Ringo comes in with that wider experience, he had more to draw on, and he slotted in, and it worked. But I see them as two separate bands. Yeah. So yes, you can like both Pete and Ringo. Yeah. It's allowed.
Yeah, it's allowed. One of the things actually is funny is that they never actually did any 12-bar, 12-bar original, which is, I think, fairly disastrous. But anyway, they never really did any 12-bar blues. And when they did try to write songs that were similar to the ones they used to play, such as I'm Down, I mean, it's a good song, but it's sort of Long Tall Slowly Light a little bit. Yeah. It's a good rave-up, you know?
Yeah.
But that's very interesting you said that, because they never really recaptured that as originals.
No,
I mean, I get one after 909, perhaps, more or less. Yeah,
and maybe Blues a little bit was, I think, was John's attempt to do it. But most of it, no. They went from being this great covers band to a live band.
Totally reinvented.
A new band completely.
Yeah, amazing. Have you ever met anyone who was at Little Town Hall? Have you ever interviewed them? Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Just people that don't know, it's 27th of December 1960. They come back from Hamburg. They hadn't been anything in Liverpool before they went to Hamburg. No. They kind of went from not being on the scene to being top of the tree, almost, more or less. Were they actually technically good, or was it more of a driving style?
No, technically they had become so good. I interviewed Chaz Newby, who of course played bass
that night,
for those 4 gigs over the Christmas 1960. And he'd noticed, because he was in the Blackjacks with Pete Best, and so he'd seen the Quarrymen playing at the Casbah. And he said the difference was phenomenal. He said, and this is one of the key things, because as well as interviewing Chaz, I interviewed a guy called Farron with Pamela's Flamingos, big Merseybeat band. And he was of the typical groups at the time. They were dance bands. This is what most people don't realise. Back then, you were hired at a dance. You had to play the songs like we're on the records. People danced in the hall. You wore your suits and your ties, and you looked smart. And Farron says, no, he was watching them, and the curtain goes up. Paul launches into Long Tall Sally. The Beatles are dressed in their leather jackets, jeans, cowboy boots. The hair was a bit longer. Nobody had seen anything like them. And instead of dancing, Farron said, I was standing there with all these girls around me. And suddenly they just left. And they all just went to the stage. Right. And they watched, and they stamped, and they cheered.
Sort of surged.
There was a big surge.
Yeah.
And that was their first taste of Beatlemania. And technically, they had become so tight as a band. That's what happens when you play hundreds of hours. So it's a different eyewitness of Chaz and of Farron. The difference was absolutely huge.
Yeah. I mean, same thing happened with Bob Dylan, actually, because he went on the road and he sort of early 60s, and he left this tiny little town called Hibbing and learned to play harmonica. And that's where all this stuff about selling your soul to the devil comes from. It's like, how the fuck did you get? Where did you get all that from?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I don't know how much of a Bob Dylan fan you are.
Not at all.
No, right. But it's like, you know, in the 60s you've got Wanna Hold Your Hand on one side, and then you've got him, and he's writing these songs of like 12, 13 verses. Even if you don't like him, I mean, it's like,
great songwriter.
Where is he getting all this from?
Great songwriter.
You know, you do wonder that sometimes. And with the Beatles, you're absolutely right with the music hall from. You're thinking like, where do they get all this songwriting from? It's there's always this eternal mystery. Right? I think that's maybe why we're still talking about
exactly.
it now.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Can you summarise your books? Because you've been very kind to meet me here. And can you just talk about your books, including your Inspector Rock? Don't leave that one out.
Oh yes, must mention Inspector Rock, yeah.
Right.
So my first book was Liverpool, Birthplace of the Beatles. Came out in hardback in 2009. Sold out in 2 years. Did the second edition. It's now in its third edition. So it sold quite a few thousand. And that all started because I was signed off work. I wasn't well. Diagnosed with fibromyalgia eventually, and I was retired from work. And my doctor said find something to do. My kids were at Dovedale at the time, which is where John and George went. So we got involved with fundraising, and Yoko Ono was the one who gave us a big donation, which was great. And I thought, didn't expect that. I thought, I wonder if anybody would be interested in the story. So I wrote this for what was the London Beatles fan club, and we eventually become the British Beatles fan club. So I enjoyed writing, and it became just something to do. Because I thought, I'll go and read a book on the Beatles in Liverpool and go and find all these places that I've grown up, you know, them all around me, because where I live is just off Penny Lane. I lived there for 30 years. And apart from a little guidebook, there was no book. I think, hang on, there's hundreds and hundreds of books being published about the Beatles, and nobody's done one about Liverpool. Crazy. So that's what I worked on. So I spent 9 years working on it.
Was it a guidebook, or was it, what form was it?
It's a bit of everything.
Oh, okay.
So I went back to speak to all the people who were there at the time that I could. The guys from the Quarrymen, Alan Williams, we mentioned before, Sam Leach, Julia Baird, John's sister, all these various people who were there at the time. So I got their stories and interviews in there, the key events, and then the back third of the book is a guidebook, separated into the suburbs of Liverpool, every place with a Beatles connection. There's like 800 pictures in there. So it's still the only Beatles book really just about Liverpool, which is why it stayed popular. For me, it was something to do. But suddenly everyone's saying, wow, never seen a book like this before. You know, Bill Heckle at the Cavern said, this is the best Beatles book I've seen in 20 years. I went, hey, what? I wasn't expecting
keep going with this
then,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Liverpool came out in 2009. One of the chapters I did in there was called the Fab 27. Because everybody kept saying, how do you go from being the Quarrymen to the Fab Four? So I went through a list then of tracking all the musicians that came and went.
I know what's coming here. So you started at 27. And,
so that was one chapter in Liverpool. And everybody said, that's fascinating. And I did a little grid of different band names and musicians. I thought, there's more of a story in that. So I thought, okay, I'll do a story of those Fab 27. And then it got to 30, and 36, 42. I think, okay, where's this ending? And it ends up, I get 104 people, which is why it's called the Fab 104.
Wait, have you found any since then? It hasn't gone up from 100.
Oh, I found a couple more, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So a new edition, Fab 106. It doesn't have the same ring, though.
No, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't.
So when I got to 104, I thought, Fab 104,
that's
close
too
enough to
perfect.
Fab 4.
Yeah,
I'll have
that's
that.
too perfect, yeah. Stick with that.
So I call myself the 105th Beatle.
Right.
And nobody's challenged me on that one yet.
Right.
So that became the story of the second book, which was how they went from that first lineup of the group and ended up at the end of 1962. So it's all the musicians, but like a rock family tree of any other groups they were in, which brings in Ringo with Roy Storm, the Hurricanes, George's group, the Rebels.
Oh, I see, right. Not 104 who'd actually played in the band.
No.
Oh, I see.
So what they had, but to qualify, they had to have either been in the group with them, been in another group that
with one of the members,
with one of them that had played on stage with them when they acted, because they acted as a backing group a number of times for a lot of different artists.
Oh, I see, right. Oh, so the Strippers, one of the... Janice,
absolutely.
She one of the
legend is Janice.
Right.
Yeah. But then I thought, there's also the story of those who helped them get where they got. So the people who taught them to play. So fascinating, like guy Ian James, who taught Paul to play guitar.
But not Bert Whedon. The songbook doesn't count.
He doesn't count. He wasn't physically there.
Right, yeah.
So anybody who contributed musically to their journey, like the favourite one I always quote is Arthur Pendleton. And I says, who's Arthur Pendleton?
Yeah.
He was a near neighbour of Julia when she lived in Blomfield Road with Bobby Dykins. He lived 2 houses along, and Arthur was a very good harmonica player. And he taught John to play the harmonica. So when you come to those first Beatles singles, the thing that got them the contract was the harmonica on Love Me Do.
Absolutely.
Because Love Me Do is a crap song. I just don't like it at all. Don't like it. But the harmonica makes it stand out. So Arthur Pendleton deserves his credit for teaching John to play the harmonica. So all these people who I think deserve a little bit of credit, it tells their story. So I've got stories in there which nobody else has ever got. It's a lovely thing because Fab 104 came out around the same time as Tune In, and I was at the International Beatle Week at the Adelphi, and Mark Lewison came over to me. He said, "Come on, show me your Norman Chapman chapter."
I thought he was going to challenge you to an arm wrestle.
Oh no, we wouldn't do that.
No, it's a joke. Yeah.
And to be fair to Mark, he said, there's so much fantastic original research in this. It's great. And because I'd tracked Norman Chapman's family down and photos which he hadn't been able to do, so I go digging to see who I can find. So the Fab 104 came out in 2013. So many wonderful reviews. People absolutely love the history in that. From that, a friend of mine, Gary Popper, who was producer of the Looking for Lennon film, he said, "I'm working on some film projects. I've got your Fab 104 book. Where the hell do you find all these people? Would you like to work with us on the Lennon film?" And while we were working on that, he said, "I was reading your book and I realised you mentioned there's 12 drummers that they had in that period up to 62. Nobody's ever written about the drummers. Shall we do a book together?" "Yeah, I'm up for that." So we thought 12 drummers drumming. Perfect. Until I found 13th.
Did you bring it out
And
on
the
December
14th.
the 25th? Or?
Well, we were going to, but then I kept finding more drummers. So your challenge is, I've got 23 drummers from 1956 to 1970. How many can you name? I've found drummers who nobody else has.
I'm not going to take that quiz now, by the way.
Yes. I'll accept a written answer from you.
All right.
I would demand it.
All right.
So I go digging and finding out who all the drummers were, because they all played a part. And Ringo comes in around 14 or 15, I think. But as well as just having the stories of them, it was sort of, well, let's take this seriously as well, because the big story is always around Pete Best and Ringo Starr and that change. And what has bugged me since day one was, why did they sack Pete Best? It's kept me going for years. So I wanted to do an analysis of Pete's drumming and Ringo's drumming, because both of them have disparaging remarks about them. Like Ringo, "Oh, he's lucky. Right place, right time. Anybody could have done it." To prove,
bullshit.
Yeah, rubbish, absolute rubbish.
Absolute rubbish, yeah.
But I needed to back that up with experts. So I think we used like 9 or 10 drummers in total. But we did the same for Pete, for My Bonnie, the Decca audition. And those drummers picked out stuff I would never pick up on.
Could you give us one example of that? Because I'm not a drummer either, so
Yeah.
I'm quite interested in this.
When we go through the Decca audition, I'd never sort of listen for the drumming. Now we know on the day they weren't great. You can
They
understand.
were hungover, it was the 1st of January.
And they're in this huge studio for the first time. And they're still kids. We keep forgetting the fact. No, they're only young. So they were terrified, fair enough. Paul's voice is shaky all the way through. Some of George's lead guitar work isn't great. Some of John's vocals aren't as good.
Sort of restrained.
Yeah,
a little
yeah.
bit.
George, I think, comes out best as a vocalist that day.
Vocally, yeah.
Now, I think if he did cut the 15 down to half a dozen, there were half a dozen really good songs that they could have got signed for. But the main thing was, what about Pete? And I got these drummers to analyse him. And the comments they were hearing, they were saying, "No problem with his timing on that. Nice variation. That's different to that one." A couple that said, "Maybe I'd have done that differently. It needs a little bit slightly different in that place." But overall, they said he was trying quite progressive things for the time. And there was variation. And I thought, okay, because I'm not a drummer, I couldn't hear that. So they were picking all this stuff out. But anybody who tries to blame Pete for failing the Decca audition, there's no evidence for it. So again, I would say, if you're reading somebody's opinion on the Decca audition, if they're not a drummer, it's just somebody's opinion. And that's why I could not sit down and say, this is my opinion, because I can't back that up. But I can say, this is what drummers say independently, listening to it. It was absolutely fascinating. Pete comes out of it really well. And that's why, with the book, done like a double CD. So it's got all the Decca Audition on, all these tracks we talk about. It's all on there, so you can listen, make your own mind up. So there's lots of myths out there. I wanted to get through them. But the biggest one with the Find the Fourth Beatle was I went to interview Brian Epstein's lawyer, David Harris. It was one of those moments where you're just in conversation and we're talking through the management contract, explaining why Brian didn't sign them. I think some people said it made the contract illegal or invalid, which it wasn't. It's unenforceable by Brian, but the others could be tied to him.
Oh, I see.
Well, David explained that legally. The reason why Brian didn't sign was in English law back then, if you were under the age of 21, a parent or guardian had to sign for you. So Brian had all the parents' details taken out.
Were they all under 21 at that time? Oh.
And there's your problem, because who isn't? Who's already 21?
Well, John.
John.
Yeah.
Because John signed the contract. If Brian had signed the contract, John would have been legally tied into Brian.
Oh, I see.
And if Brian didn't do what he did, he wanted them to be able to walk away. If Brian had signed it, John would have been legally tied to Brian
So
for 12
it was
months.
like a gracious act, you mean?
Absolutely.
Wow.
That's why Brian didn't sign it. So in law, because the four of them signed the contract and Brian did what he said he would do, they could enforce the contract on Brian, even though the other three were underage. Because Brian didn't sign it, he could not enforce the contract on them.
Very interesting.
Right, he's cleared that one up. And we got through to the big one, which was the sacking of Pete Best.
Yeah.
And we're going through it and I'm saying, there's lots of things troubling me with this, but please explain the process. And we get through the letters, and after the evidence says nothing happened until after the Parlophone audition. Now, with lawyers, I also established that that was an audition, they weren't under contract.
And that was June?
6th of June.
6th of June.
Yeah, they were not under contract. It was still an audition. George Martin didn't confirm the contract until the end of July. But because George Martin said to Brian, I'm going to use a session drummer, Pete can't do what I want for the record. Brian, who is ignorant of studio protocols, goes to John Paul and George says, George Martin doesn't think Pete's good enough to play on the record.
Oh, whereas using a session drummer was quite normal.
Yep,
Yeah.
so I've got a whole chapter on the use of session drummers.
Yeah.
Because that, particularly for a first record, very, very commonplace. They didn't know that. Paul's comments were, Brian says that, I thought, what are we going to do? You know, Pete worked great in the clubs when we're playing live, but this is our last chance for a record deal. If the producer doesn't think Pete's good enough, we're going to have to change the drummer. So that's when the discussions start. Think, okay, George Martin's made that comment, even if it isn't what George intended, that's how they heard it. They decide then, we've got to get a new drummer. So Brian goes to David Harris, the lawyer, and says, here's our issue. If the contract comes through, we're going to have to get rid of Pete and get a new drummer in. And David Harris says, well, you've got a problem there, because you can't sack Pete. And this was the point. He said, okay, let's just go through this one more time. Are you telling me that Pete Best wasn't sacked? And he said, yeah, Pete was never sacked. He couldn't be sacked because Brian was their manager, but Brian was employed by John, Paul, George and Pete. Brian didn't employ them. They employed him. To be sacked, you have to be employed. And there's another one I found that had never been found before. Was at the end of 1961, John, Paul, George and Pete signed a partnership agreement as a legal partnership in the same solicitor's office as Brian's lawyer. Now, in the end, whether they'd had that or not didn't matter, because in law, they were a legal partnership. You cannot sack a partner. You have to dissolve the partnership.
And who knew all this at the time? This is where I'm confused.
David Harris and Brian.
Oh, okay.
Now, the chances are Brian's had this discussion with John, Paul and George.
Okay.
Their problem was there wasn't the time to go through all the hassle of dissolving the partnership, drawing up accounts. So, okay, this is how you get paid off, starting it all again. They didn't have time to do that. So they had to get Brian to trick Pete into thinking he was being sacked.
Okay.
Without ever telling him he was sacked. And if you go back to the wording that has been well established by Brian, by Pete, Brian says to him, don't know how to tell you this, Pete, but the boys want you out. Your partners want to get rid of you. And Ringo's joining on Saturday. He never mentions being sacked. He just said they don't want you to play in the group and they've already got a replacement. Now, young 21-year-old, no, he's nearly 21, with no legal background. Of course, I'd been sacked, but he hadn't been sacked.
So what's the agreement once Ringo's in? Legally, what's happening?
See, this is where
I'm already a bit confused, I've got to be honest. You've explained it very well, but
it's
a thick
I'm trying to summarise it because there's a lot of it. It's all in the book. So the problem is, they could kick him out and not play with him, but legally, he was still with the Beatles. So they've got to get him out. So Brian is contractually obligated to provide work for Pete. So he offers them the position with the Mersey Beats, but they're Tony and Billy are 15, 16. Pete was never going to accept that. Brian's best mate is Joe Flannery. Joe Flannery says to Pete, I'm putting together this band, Lee Curtis and the All-Stars. Do you want to be our drummer? Yeah, good, I'll do that. By Pete joining Lee Curtis and the All-Stars, legally he quits the Beatles.
Oh, I see. Because then he went on What's My Line, didn't he, in America? So actually what he said, I went to work for another band, he's telling the truth.
And what Bill Harry wrote in Mersey Beat, it was all very amicable.
Mutual consent.
Mutual consent.
Yeah.
And that's effectively what it was.
Right.
Without realising he was being tricked. It was mutual consent because Brian said to him without sacking him, they don't want you in the group anymore. And Pete agreed and left. Now this has happened a few times in music history. The most high profile one that I quote in the book is with the Eagles. They put a new contract together that Don Henley and Glenn Fry would get more money than the others. Don Felder didn't agree. So Glenn and Don Henley said to Irvin Azoff, the manager, go and tell Don he's no longer in the band. So they did that, just like Brian did with Pete. It took them 6 years to resolve it out of court because Don Felder was still a partner in the Eagles. Pete Best was a partner in the Beatles. He could not be sacked.
Wow. And how long did he stay in showbiz?
He was in Lee Curtis and the All-Stars.
Some touring.
And then there were the various guises of the Pete Best 4, the Pete Best combo. So he did that for another couple of years. Then he packed it in.
Worked in a bakery.
Yeah, and then in a job centre for years as well.
He did try and take his own life.
He did,
sometime
sadly.
in the late 60s.
Yeah.
But, we're all happy, aren't we? Got it together.
Exactly.
And belatedly, of course, with the anthology. How much did he make from the anthology?
We don't know, but it's millions.
Few million, yeah. Few million.
So everybody's happy that he did. But the biggest mystery was why Pete was sacked. And then I find out he was never sacked.
Well, Spencer Lee did a whole book about it.
He did.
And he had like a chart with all the different reasons. And
it's Murder on the Orient Express.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
So I think all those excuses that came later, of not hanging out together, he was quiet, wouldn't get the haircut and stuff like that, they were all secondary reasons. Probably when Brian says to them, George Martin doesn't think he's good enough, they think, well, we can't do that. But then there's the meeting, well, if we do this, Pete doesn't always hang out with us. Oh yeah, that's true. And Brian, it would get Mona off your back, wouldn't it? Oh yeah, absolutely. They then justify it to themselves that they can make the decision.
Plus, of course, there's the Mona and Neil Aspinall's baby as well.
Oh yeah, there's that as
well. A
well.
little bit,
Yeah, exactly. So they were all secondary reasons, but the evidence says nothing happened until after Parlophone, and now we know the evidence conclusively cannot be argued with. Pete Best was never sacked.
Would it be strange, a parallel universe where he stayed with a band? What do you think would have happened? Like Rubber Soul, Revolver? Can I say one thing? I love YouTube, but it's a bit cruel what those people have done.
Yeah.
Of adding his drumming to some... actually it sounds alright on Come Together.
Yeah.
It's a bit unfair,
And also you think, okay, again what I was saying before, what was Ringo playing in 1962? That's all you can go on at the time.
So Pete may have developed, we don't know, do we?
He probably would have done. Yeah. Every musician does.
Yeah.
But Ringo, I think it still comes back to the fact he was the perfect one at that time, and all the way through the Beatles' career, they got this far, but they need to make that change. And Ringo comes in, and they take the next step up. All the way through, the right people are there at the right time. So even,
and they're ambitious, of course.
Well, of course they were.
Very ambitious.
Of course they were.
All right. We could talk forever.
Inspector Rock.
Yeah, I don't want to take your whole day up, but please talk about Inspector Rock. Go for it.
It's funny that a lot of people say about my writing, my research, it's like detective work.
Yeah.
Because they got a forensic approach. And that's how I see it. I've been a fan of Sherlock Holmes from when I was a kid. And I watch detective stories and stuff all the time.
Shamrock Wombs.
Shamrock Wombs. Exactly. Yeah. In fact, somebody did that on a review for me. Move over Shamrock Wombs.
Yeah. God, sorry.
And so I've always had this love of crime fiction. I've got a couple of stories lying around the house which I never did anything with. But I thought, wouldn't this be fun to have a fictional detective based in Liverpool in 1960. And the Beatles appear in the story. And so the first one is called That'll Be the Day That I Die. And the opening scene is in the Jacaranda Club where we are now. And what I'm doing for each of the stories is picking a key moment of some sort in Beatle history. So this is around, mentioned just before, when he backed Janice the stripper at the strip club. So they're the bums still hanging out at the Jack. So there's a fictional victim, Inspector Rock, who's our fictional detective. These fictional murders, investigations going on. But the Beatles are always sort of around. So when the first argument happens, they're sat in the Jack and they knew the girl who was killed. And it goes out to the Burton Wood airfield. So we've got an American involved in there as well. Mm-hmm. And so it just sort of, it deals with all kinds of stuff that was happening in Liverpool at the time with the Beatles in there. But obviously not as suspects or anything, but just, they get, yeah, I want to make that very, very clear.
Yeah.
But just, it brings in a bit of Beatle history, because I know what Liverpool was like back then, so I can paint the picture of it. And I thought, it's a bit of fun. I self-published, put it out there, see what the reaction was, and people have absolutely loved it.
Wow. And when did that come out?
It's only 2 years ago, 2017. So I've actually got 6 stories planned. I've just got so many other projects on the go. The second one is Long Tall Sally, which will link the Beatles' time in Hamburg. So that's half written. But
yeah, I feel like there's still a lot about Hamburg to be written, actually.
There's a lot more there. Hamburg's always fascinated me. I'm working on 2 projects at the moment, which will feature Hamburg quite heavily. Hoping that we're going to be making a documentary in the similar sort of style to Looking for Lennon. We're going to try and make a documentary about the Beatles in Hamburg.
And Looking for Lennon, just briefly, tell us about that.
Yeah, so Looking for Lennon, we spent 3 years, very small production team in Liverpool, but we wanted to tell John's story, really sort of pre-fame. So Roger Appleton, the director, and I, we sat down and we watched every John Lennon documentary that had been done. The good, the bad and the ugly. Very, very few good.
Which ones would you say were good ones?
I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head, there was...
The one for the real John Lennon, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was, and there was...
I felt like there was a bit missing from that.
Yeah.
It wasn't too bad.
Probably there was one that I thought was really good, only because the worst one was, I think it was the BBC, did one on, let me just say, it's one of the anniversaries of John's death, and it was a tribute to John Lennon. They reeled out all these celebrities, none of whom knew John Lennon.
Right.
Some of whom weren't even born when he was killed. I thought, really? That's the best you can do? So we said, our criteria will be, we'll bring historians in, and a Beatles historian like me in. But apart from that, we want to interview the people who knew John. So school friends from Dovedale, Quarrybank, people like Helen Anderson, June Furlong, Rod Murray from the Art College, the Quarrymen obviously. So all these people who knew John and got their stories, and really the cut-off was him becoming a Beatle in '62 and then getting the record deal. And I said the one thing I wanted to finish with was John's original version of Help. Because of course when he wrote that, and we got that, there's a clip on YouTube, isn't it?
1970s, piano demo. Yeah.
Piano, and it's slow. Because, as you know, John said that was his cry for help. And he put this message out to millions of people and nobody heard it. Because they popped it up for the film. And if you watch the film footage, John's standing there, laughing and joking, smiling, help me if you can, and feeling down. And that was a cry for help. Because he said, at that point, I could feel nothing. I was numb. So he just got a local musician just to record it, just him and a guitar, blues version. And you get the power of the lyrics, which you lose in the Beatle version of it. And you look at the tragedies that went through John's life, and you think, is it any wonder he was screwed up?
All those deaths.
Yeah. Oh, terrible stuff going on. So we wanted to tell John's story, put all those people who knew him best. Nigel Wally, the last of the 4 friends, obviously Ivan and Pete.
He was the one who saw Julia just before.
Yeah.
I mean, that haunted him forever.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you imagine?
We interviewed him walking down from Mendips and just standing on the corner and telling us the story. And you can see it still affects him today, as it would.
I don't want to go into too much and too macabre, but he heard the screech of the brakes. He didn't actually see it.
He turned round.
Did he see you?
He saw Julia flying through the air. Then he ran over to her, and there she was, lying on the road.
He saw the body.
Oh yeah. And he said, I knew she was dead.
Mercifully, it was quite instant.
Yes.
It was an instant death.
Yes. Yeah.
One thing.
So we wanted those people who knew John first hand. We thought nobody's really done that before, and make it as authentic. So, and we were fortunate, we got nominated for a National Film Award for Best Documentary. We were very, very close to being nominated for a BAFTA. It's now being sold worldwide. It's still on Sky Television over here to watch. So very proud.
Where else is it available? Streaming or anything?
Yes, you can get it iTunes. So there's various streaming ones, downloads. So on Sky TV in Britain you can watch it. That will be off there soonish. It's already DVD and Blu-ray in America. I think it's out in Italy now. The rest of Europe is to follow. It's going to China, Australia. I mean, it's going all around the world. So it's something we're very proud of because we wanted it to be genuine, authentic. Try and understand John Lennon.
And you posted something on social media. Can you tell us about that? Because I want to try and help you with that because you've been so generous with your time.
So from the small team of us who made Looking for Lennon, a lot of people have asked me over the years to do a documentary on Liverpool. And so I was talking with Roger Appleton the other day and we said, we could do this because nobody's really sort of done that Liverpool story. So just put it out on Facebook to a friend and said, look, here's a suggestion, here's an idea. If we did that, and maybe we did it as a Kickstarter fundraiser, would you back it? Do you think we should do it? The overwhelming response from everybody was, yeah, just go and do it. We back it, so okay, we'll put that together as a package and we'll try and get that filmed and introduce people to the Beatles Liverpool.
Well, I mean, there's already been a response on social media. So
That's
I don't know.
phenomenal.
I don't feel like you have any trouble.
No, and I didn't think I would, but it's different from friends liking what you're doing, but then saying, this has to be done properly as a business. Would you financially back it?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that will be happening.
Yeah. And how long would a project like that take?
Not too long because obviously all the research is done, and the plan would be sort of along the way. So if we're going to Rosebery Street, you know, we'll have Charlie Roberts will come on and tell us about taking the photos. So at the different places we'd have those people linked to the story, and I'd chat with them about the links. And so just tell the Liverpool story of the Beatles and the Liverpool story.
I hate to end with a cliche, but the interest in the story never dies.
But it doesn't, and it's so fascinating. I had this discussion with Martin King from the Beatles story, and he's been director of that for years. And we'd get together and we'd delve into this sort of depth and beyond in our conversations. But you were saying that why is there only something like the Beatles story when you get like over 400,000 people a year going there? Why not the other bands? Why is there not the Rolling Bones? I call them the Strolling Bones. Why is not the Rolling Stones story? I think mostly because there is a story, and the Beatles story is very, very unique.
And there's a story behind every song. I mean, you know, that Hard Day's Right book.
Yeah, Steve Turner.
I mean, can you imagine like, I don't know, the Kinks? I don't think there's a story behind all their songs. I mean, people don't...
Waterloo Sunset. You get a bit of that all over. There's little stories in there. Yeah. But
every single song has got some story. I mean, in a way, this is almost my mission with this podcast, to try and I still haven't got there. It's elusive. What exactly is it? We know more or less what it is. You know, we know they had all the attributes, but there's something else. And I actually wrote a blog post called "The Beatles and a Massive Humanity," and it's about you'll know the date. It's the night when Pete Best actually met his future wife. And they did the twist together. Yeah, I should have checked this. I think it's April '62. It's about that. It's just come back from Hamburg.
Yeah.
And there's this magic night, and a couple of people I've interviewed actually mentioned it. It's something to do with people. It's people, and it's a family thing. I remember Norman Hurricane Smith, who they used to call Normal.
Yes.
He was on a documentary, and another thing I talk to people about is where did the split start?
Yeah.
Because we know all about the White Album was tense and everything.
Yeah.
Philip Norman said once, John Lennon wanted to leave the Beatles in 1963, and John Lennon, of course, with his classic hyperbole, said, I was looking for a way out the Beatles from day one. And I was like, yeah, not sure about that. Yeah. But anyway, you know, it's this kind of idea of maybe a slow death. And Norman Smith actually said that when they came back from the 65 American tour, Shea Stadium, when they came back to make Rubber Soul, he said something had changed. Yeah. That family sense had gone. And they just started to become individuals. And obviously, you know, Revolver, they were very much together. But it's very interesting. It must be something primal because it's not only the music, it's something that people respond to. What do you think?
But it is the music, and I think the reason why they'll keep talking about them is because they're the Mozart and Tchaikovsky of this generation.
Yeah.
And that's why we still talk about those great composers from a couple of hundred years ago. That is why the Beatles will be remembered, because the musical contribution, they changed everything. You know, I did a talk to a group of American students a few weeks ago, the general Beatles history, how they became a band, all that kind of stuff. And then it got to the last slide and said, so what? What difference does that make to you? I said, right, well, I'll explain. before the Beatles, you didn't really have singer-songwriters doing anything. Certainly not with a band doing their own stuff. Since then, I mean, Dick Rowe's classic line of "Who's for the guitars on the way out."
Yeah.
They weren't in.
There weren't any.
They hadn't arrived.
They weren't, just the Shadows.
Yeah, exactly.
They didn't sing. So.
No. And so they changed that. Since then, guitar-based groups have always been in. Different fads have come and gone. They're still in. There's songwriting styles, particularly when the personal stuff about Liverpool and things like that. It wasn't just "I love her, she loves me." Yeah. That was the early stuff, but that was just to get them well known. Making the album sleeve a work of art, progressing every album musically, and affecting culture, affecting society, fashion. Being in America and being asked about the Vietnam War. They're a pop group from Liverpool.
Yeah, incredible.
Then John using that. I love the Beddings for Peace. It's genius. I don't care if you're laughing at me.
We're willing to be the world's clowns.
Yeah, because we still talk about it now. Yeah. So it worked. It was genius.
Yeah.
They took music beyond listening to a record.
The other incredible thing about the recording studio, of course, people, what would it used to be like 1 till 4 and 7 till 10. The engineers were wearing white coats, which I always thought was hilarious. You know, did they know John Lennon was a bit crazy or something? The thing that I always found incredible is that I wasn't alive in the 60s, but there was very limited TV, and if you didn't live in one of the big cities, you didn't really go out beyond, let's say, 11 o'clock or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
So essentially, all the country's asleep from, let's say, midnight until 8 the next morning.
Yeah.
And the Beatles are creating this music while the rest of the country's asleep.
Yeah.
I always just love that image. I also think there may be something to creating music in the middle of the night as well. Perhaps some dreamy quality comes out because it's the middle of the night.
I do my best thinking at night because it's the only time really in the day when all the distractions have gone. Yeah. And your brain is settling down and you're starting to process everything. Yeah. And you file it away in your filing cabinet in your head. Well, that's how I explain it anyway. Yeah. And then suddenly that's where the other bit of my brain starts making all these connections and thinking it's either pen and paper handy or these days grab my phone and if I don't put my glasses on and I write this note to remind me the next day and then I put my glasses on and I think, what the hell did I...
Maybe it comes out as amazing poetry though, you might create something else.
Guaranteed, never. But that's a fantastic time because everybody else and the whole world goes to sleep.
Twilight Zone, isn't it?
Yeah. And you switch off. Yeah. And it's an inspirational time.
Yeah. Very interesting because I've just come back from Madrid.
Yeah.
I was part of a huge community of musicians. So you can imagine a bunch of musicians together. And musicians and insomnia have something of a relationship.
Yeah.
You know, their mind's always going and everything.
Yeah.
And I actually did a series of interviews with my friends to help promote them, and they're all on YouTube and everything. Yeah. And we were talking about that. And I used to have a problem with insomnia. And I'd go to bed at, say, 12 or 1, and I'd wake up at 5. And, of course, the first instinct is to try and get back to sleep. You think, oh, shit, we're going to go back to sleep. I only had 4 hours sleep. But then there's that hazy quality. Mm-hmm. I am an English teacher as well. Yeah. I'd suddenly have good ideas for classes.
Exactly.
I'd have good ideas for songs. I'd have good ideas because I write short stories as well, and I write a blog. I'd have good ideas. And we all agreed, try and stay up, you know. Try and get back to sleep eventually, but stay up. Yeah. Use that half an hour, that hour.
Definitely.
And it's paid off.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's worth feeling a bit drowsy in the next morning.
Yeah. I get exactly the same thing. Yeah. That's where I get a lot of my ideas. Yeah. When there's no other noises around.
Well, of course, Yellow Submarine was written. Paul called it the Twilight Zone. When you're almost asleep and you're not quite, you get funny ideas. All right. Well, we could go all day, clearly.
We certainly could.
Thank you very much. We've done 1 hour, 50 minutes. And I'm going to close it. So you're going to take me downstairs and show me the artwork in the basement of the veranda.
Yeah.
Now, was that John Stew or Paul as well?
No. Paul wasn't involved. John wasn't involved. The only one of the Beatles involved was Stuart with Rod Murray. And I think it was Rob Jones as well, another friend from art college. The only artwork that John and Paul were involved in was painting over all the scroll in the women's toilets.
That's it, yeah. I knew I'd got that confused.
Yeah, that's where it was.
I mixed the old stories.
Yeah, but the wall art, that was Stuart and the 2 rods.
Okay.
Now, all of the original stuff, because it got damp, fell off years ago. There's one small portion left that Stuart would have done. That's all.
And I'm going to see it in 2 minutes' time.
Yeah. So if you're watching this podcast, you can see it with us.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're not watching it, no. No, I have this thing about putting my face out there. I'd much rather people just heard my voice.
No, people say I have the perfect face for radio. Yeah. So.
Well, as we were saying, I think it was off air. We were talking. I've always had a fascination with audio. I grew up listening to the radio, and it concentrates you more. Because human beings are generally more visual than auditory. So when you've got the visual, they're going to concentrate more on that. So you pay attention more to the voice.
Or people will be listening to this and will have fallen asleep.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
So.
Well, I'm going to cut it into sections, but
I'll just say, good night, sleep well.
We're on part 20 now. Anyway, thank you very much. And can you give us your details, your website and everything?
Yeah, so everything now, if you go to davidabedford.com, I'm blogging almost every day, doing all kinds of stuff from Beatles history, from the various books and projects, keeping everybody up to date. Yeah. So that's the best place to go, and then there's links from there to get my books and all that kind of stuff. So,
all right. Yeah. Thanks a lot, and good luck in the future.
My absolute pleasure.
So there you have it. Hope you enjoyed that. My chat with David Bedford live in Liverpool. Talking of Liverpool, I will be going up there again very soon. I may have some news about that, in fact. When I go up there, I do try and contact someone in advance and try to do some kind of interview with them. Skype is fine, of course, but there's nothing better sometimes than sitting there with somebody. The only thing is you have to find a quiet place, because as you heard there was a little bit of noise going on. Not too much, I think. We got away with it. So also thanks to Darin Murphy for letting me use those clips. Should have explained at the beginning, Darin is a professional musician. He's got a covers band as well. So there's a link to his appearance on When They Was Fab. Amazing, he goes through all the albums like I was saying and talks about how Ringo's sound evolves. I've never heard anyone playing live drums demonstrating it with that much clarity. So just to let you know the guests that are coming up. The next guest I think is going to be Philip Kirkland, who wrote All Roads Lead to Lennon, which I may have mentioned I think during part 1 of my David Bedford talk. It's basically a history book taking the John Lennon story up to John himself, but there's plenty of stuff about his relatives, Julia and so forth. Again, some amazing coincidences, as we've seen. Anyone who's read Tune In, I've referenced a few of them here. And then the one after that is probably going to be a film review. I'm going to be reviewing with a film podcaster. I won't tell you about him now, but we're just finalising that. We're going to review the 2 Imagine films. The 1988 Andrew Salt film, which is the one that used John Lennon audio clips as a sort of narration. And then also the original Imagine film, which actually, it was shot in 71, but I think came out in 72, which is basically music videos from the Imagine album. It's wonderfully weird. I think we've talked about it already at some point. The chess match when they're putting the pieces in their mouth, and the game of pool where the balls just stay on the table. Brilliant stuff. Anyway, so that'll be coming out. And then got loads of other ideas. I'm going to be doing a podcast about Revolution 9, which I absolutely adore. I've cultivated a love for that piece over the years, and I've got tons to say about that, and I'll be using, again with their permission, a couple of clips of other people analysing it. So that'll be coming up soon. So I'm going to talk to Philip this week, Philip Kirkland. So that should be, we can stay on schedule, that'll be out in a couple of weeks. The numbers for the podcast are slowly, steadily rising. Still haven't got an iTunes, Apple Music, Apple Podcast, whatever you want to call it. Still working on that. But spreading myself around the social media. Such a lovely thing. I've never said this before, but really for me it's just amazing to think that people all around the world have heard about my podcast from wherever, from other people. Hopefully word of mouth is a nice thing. Or, they've been searching on John Lennon podcasts, whatever. Just to think that they'd be around the world appreciating something you do. Because as I've said before, the editing takes a long time. So really it's about that. It's about connection. It's a wonderful thing, and it keeps me doing this because I haven't monetized this whatsoever. It's a labour of love, and it does take a while to put together, but it's all worth it. So, can hear the music coming up there. So hopefully you'll keep listening, and we'll be back very soon. Thanks very much for listening, and take care. Goodbye.